My name is Michelle Attias, and among other things, I am a PhD candidate in this department. So, love Ohio State, the Ohio State University. So I'm here to give my presentation titled Journaling in Search of the Neurodivergent Self. It's an arts-based research project engaging with Kurt Cobain's journals. So here I am living grunge. I'm like, I was young once. Like my kids look at me and I can't ever imagine that I was a young person. But, you know, coming of age in the early 90s, it would be hard to kind of escape this media obsession with Kurt Cobain. Countless publications covered his short rise to fame, and countless more media outlets broadcast his suicide, seeking causation in these sorts of ableist narratives that conflated this myth conception of madness with genius. As a young adult coming of age in the early 90s, I watched Nirvana's popularity and I embraced the youth culture surrounding the emergence of the first album, Nevermind, and later the MTV Unplugged sessions, but I didn't really think that much about it at the time. Looking at this photo, I have to acknowledge the whiteness of our group and the ways in which critical disability studies applies to larger systems which act to disable and restrict access to individuals. So why Kurt Cobain? My obsession with Kurt Cobain came later when I first picked up a copy of his journals. At the time, I remember feeling a strong sense of identification and familiarity with the embodied experiences described therein, as well as the process revealed in the free-form stream of consciousness writing, and the seemingly random associations and fragmented bits of the everyday. Images, doodles, sketches, poetry, and story were all bound together in a kind of formless montage with no desire for resolution. And instead of in this sort of constant state of seeking and becoming, I thought to myself, this is my brain, and this is my arts process. I remember thinking that the identity of Cobain and the songs that I heard on the radio were somehow a watered-down representation of who he actually was, and that the interesting parts had somehow been edited out. I connected with Cobain not as a countercultural hipster, but as an artist. It was later that I learned of Cobain's early diagnosis of ADHD, a neurological condition categorized in medical model narratives by overactivity, impulsivity, poor concentration, and deviant social behavior. Similar to other neurological conditions, disorder in the medical model narrative is housed within the individual, with no consideration of environmental or sociocultural factors which work to construct it as a disorder. So I then arrived at the following research questions. Through an arts-based research dialogue with Kurt Cobain's journals, what can we learn about a neurodiverse person's journey to become an active subject, renegotiating conditions of identity surrounding difference? And then the following sub-questions. In what ways does art journaling create a space for neurodivergent individuals to develop their own rhetoricity in a society in which negative discourses dominate, removing intentionality and voice? And then what happens in the journaling process that supports neurodivergent individuals to discover new information about themselves and the world? This is part of a larger project looking at neurodivergence and the journaling process, but for today, I'm going to focus on artists Lee Lozano and Kurt Cobain. In my presentation, I will discuss significant aspects of my literature review, including critical disability studies, theoretical frameworks of neurodiversity and the neuroqueer, my methodological approach of mind meandering, and I will conclude with 2 examples of arts-based research-informed experiments and conversation with the journals of Lozano and Cobain. This project will consist of selecting sections of Cobain's journals and engaging in dialogue with those texts. Arts-based research approaches will be reframed through a critical disability studies lens, which is informed by my body-mind experience of ADHD. Included in this approach is a reflexive mixed media process that disrupts and reframes dominant discourses of ADHD through symbolic imagery and conceptual poetic experiments. That feels like the inside of my mind. That's a picture of my son's desk. So to begin thinking about a theoretical framework for this project, I began researching neurodiversity. Neurodiversity began as a movement in the late 1990s in response to negative discourses of pro-cure and anti-advocacy groups and their campaigns promoting fear of autism as a disease of epidemic proportions. Perspectives and voices of autistic people did not contribute at all to these early discourses, as parents and researchers dominated this voice of representation. Parent and medical model practitioner groups favored the search for and the use of normalizing therapies and psychopharmacological therapies, following traditional medical model approaches to fix individuals with disabilities. Fighting for their own representation, the neurodiversity movement was led by high-functioning autists with overarching goals of self-determination and self-representation, creating space for autism to be considered as natural human diversity, a different way of being and not a pathological illness. Therefore, a core value of the neurodiversity movement is the rejection of pressures of conformity and normalization, as forced normative behaviors are the product of a society that rejects diversity, whether it is neurological or based on other essential characteristics. The neurodiversity movement has broadened to include a whole host of brain-based differences, such as learning differences, ADHD, trauma, what we discussed earlier today, bipolar disorder, and with other categorical inclusion as other brain-based differences emerge. All neurological differences result in complex lived experiences, and individuals often experience a similar sense of disempowerment. For the purpose of this project, I will be examining the embodied experience of ADHD as I experience them. Melanie Yergo, you see her depicted on the left-hand side, is an author on the autism spectrum, self-defining as neuroqueer, and presenting autism as nothing short of a political identity category. Her work fits a critical disability studies theoretical framework as it seeks to produce situated knowledge in specific individual experiences, supports subjugated voices, decenters authority, and interrogates discourses surrounding autism and other neuroqueer conditions. Pushing beyond the social model of disability and its tensions between materialist definitions of impairment and disabling social practices, critical disability studies traces its origins to critical social theory, viewing society and culture as dynamically evolving, the complexity of which extends what can be captured in quantitative data. Critical disability studies examine society's politics and power relations, considering the complex ways in which race, class, gender, sexuality, and ability intersect. Using a critical disability studies lens to situate Kurt Cobain creates a space to consider the journals as a site of resistance, where a neurodiverse individual confronts disabling discourses through seeking alternative modes of expression. As art education asks us to imagine alternative literacies, critical disability studies will give insight to the ways in which neurodivergence is silenced in educational spaces, presenting alternative ways of disrupting traditional educational practices. Art education and its incorporation of different modalities of expression provides a unique space to shift and reframe discourses surrounding ADHD with the overarching effects of shifting and reframing public discourses. The term neuroqueer resists definition, but erupts out of the collaborative work of autistic bloggers Nick Walker, Ibby Grace, Athena Lynn Michaels Dillon, and Melanie Yergo. One can refer to themselves as neuroqueer if their identity has somehow been shaped by the actions of being neuroqueer or neuroqueering. Neuroqueer and all its possibilities and nuances surfaces rhizomatically from the neurodiversity movement, but also stems from the concept of queering, which represents the political move to claim queer as a political identity category. Embedded in a long history of social protest, anti-assimilation, and troubling established identity categories, neuroqueer is drawing a direct connection between LGBTQ experiences of passing and closeting and the experiences of neurodivergent individuals. Melanie Yergeau's emotionally charged text authoring Autism on Rhetoric and Neurological Queerness is filled with a narrative and symbolic imagery, rhetorical powers society erases from autistics. Yergeau's narrative account fractures the medical, theoretical, and philosophical assumptions attached to this label, redefining what it means to be autistic and reclaiming what it means to be rhetorical. By rhetorical, Yergeau is drawing upon classic understandings of embodied gestures, expressions, and social engagements, kind of like this one, showing how these logics of normal human expression and interaction continue to construct autistics not only as intentional, but also inhuman, with devastating social and legal consequences. Yergeau's work examines who has rhetorical power, as well as how this rhetorical power is enacted to enable and disable. Legibility for the neuroqueer only occurs when communication conforms to allistic expectations of performance. Using this framework to think about alternative modes or rhetorics of expression for neurodivergent individuals led me to view the process of journaling as offering unique possibilities for those who interpret sociality differently and express themselves in very different ways. I have chosen a post-structuralist, arts-based research methodological framework as a transdisciplinary practice of investigation, using art as a primary mode of critical inquiry. Arts-based research transcends the situational limitations of what positive research methods can tell us. Purposefully ambiguous, arts-based research challenges assumptions and biases and disrupts dominant narratives. Spacing out, or what I like to refer to as mind meandering, is a process immediately familiar to me when I enter Kurt Cobain's journals. Cobain was a recorder of embodied information. The journals are filled with sensory-laden descriptions, emotional rants, lists, stories, fantasies, poetry, sketches, and experiments linked together in a seemingly random series of associations. These associations wander between the everyday and the invented, shaping reality through experiment, the purpose of which is not to arrive anywhere conclusive, but to continue to explore identity and subjectivity through process. Kauser views the spontaneous process of journaling as unique in its capture of subjective experiences in ways unavailable to autobiography, as it does not await the resolution. In not seeking a destination, journaling remains true to the everyday, the day-to-day nuances of the neurodiverse body-mind, rendering journals a potentially unique site to mine for information. Cobain's journals display this mind-meandering process of creative problem-solving and dialoguing with the self. In collaboration with the journals, I am seeking to examine mind-meandering as a methodological approach for researching the embodied experiences of ADHD. I posit that mind meandering is in fact shaped by the ADHD body-mind, and it is for this reason that I turn to my experience of mind meandering to further explore ADHD ways of knowing as a methodological framework for research as my body-mind processes nuance and time and memory and sensory input in ways which inform critical disability studies, as well as pedagogical practices within arts education. This drive to alleviate boredom, which has been so problematic in educational spaces, and would probably be problematic in other workspaces other than ours, is in fact a tool of expression and discovery. Mind meandering is how I think and feel and sense and relate in a space of experimentation, not confined to one specific medium, but instead a process of intertwining disparate components and associations, the sense of which only I understand. Mind meandering is how I cope and react to situations, drawing on story, poems, songs, and sensory memory. Mind meandering is the way in which I approach my artwork and my writing, collecting impressions, scraps, and pieces, writing from the inside out in a nonlinear montage. Mind meandering describes my professional history with its seemingly random jobs, educational opportunities, and choices, which somehow feed into each other like a tapestry. Mind meandering is the way I engage with problems, drawing on multiple knowledges to address them. It's how I experience time, lost in memory, there but just not really there. Mind meandering contains what Jose Esteban Munoz refers to as the ephemera of my day-to-day experience of ADHD, the residual tracings and connective associations which bleed into everything that I do. Mind meandering is who I am as an individual representing an embodied neuroqueer perspective and self. So to begin to think about the ways in which I would engage with Cobain's journals, I began researching another neurodiverse artist by the name of Lee Lozano. Lee Lozano in 1969 describes in her journals a dialogue piece in which she would invite another person to her apartment for an exchange. After, in her journals, Lozano would not refer to any content from the dialogue, but would rate its success. Lozano never defined dialogue. We know from her journals that dialogue was interpreted very broadly in terms of exchange and included nonverbal, or what she liked to refer to as verbal. My engagement with Cobain's journals is a kind of dialogue in which a spoken text sparks a response. But what does it mean to dialogue with someone who isn't there? To begin to dialogue with the text, I contacted a fellow graduate student and artist and invited him to have a dialogue about Lozano's journals. In preparation, I photocopied pages from the journals and brought them with me. Reading the entries together, responses to different statements were triggered, and an easy and satisfying dialogue ensued. And here are the residual tracings. Lozano states, dialogues exist solely for their own sake, and that no notes and recordings should be taken. But since I am interested in dialoguing with Lozano's journals, I choose to engage with dialogue differently. Using the journals as a springboard to think about what dialogue with a text might look like, we recorded some of our responses, producing the ephemera that you see here. Residual evidence that a dialogue took place. These tracings become the remnants of a process in time, but remain insufficient to capture our exchange. This material evidence creates a departure point, an opening where additional dialogue-based performances could potentially evolve. I begin to see how I might engage with the journals of Cobain to produce something new, or what Lozano would refer to as new information. It's here that I return to Kurt Cobain as he translates a neuroqueer embodied experience using poetic language to bring something previously nebulous to the realm of the expressed, or to articulate human concerns so that they become more concrete and immediate. An example of Cobain's internal struggle to understand what it means to be happy is contained in the sketched out lyrics of what would become the Nirvana song Nevermind, or I Think I'm Dumb. When asked if it was hard to come up with ideas, Cobain stated in an interview, I just noticed that people expect more of a thematic angle with our music. You know, they always want me to read into it. And before I was just using pieces of poetry, just garbage. The stuff that would just spew out of me at the time. And a lot of times that's how I write lyrics, just at the last second because I'm really lazy. And then I find myself having to come up with an explanation. Embedded ableist performance expectations aside, this statement exposes Cobain's process, which contains many characteristics of mind meandering. And despite what Cobain states of his work, it's difficult to read the journals as anything but intentional. I begin to engage with the journals, responding with a critical disability studies lens and my own embodied experience, which I'm not going to read all of them, but I'll read one section. In response to, I'm not like them, but I can pretend, I wrote, I will only be legible if I look, perform, act a certain way. Part of this performance is acting like I feel as everyone else does. This was helpful for getting started, but part of what I had imagined when entering this dialogic space with Cobain was capturing my own embodied experiences of identification with and support of the work that he created. My goal was to do more than simply interrogate the text. I wanted to arrive somewhere. Referencing Bakhtein's literary theory of dialogue, I began by creating utterances and responses to Cobain's words. In the spirit of Cobain's process, I let it all just spew out onto cheap notebook paper without worrying about whether or not I was producing something good. I focused on feeling and imagery. I then took the entries and cut them up to place them in conversation with each other, so I'm flip-flopping between the cut-up Cobain entry and my own. I laminated them with the work laminator, which was a purposeful choice, as I wanted to use materials that are clear, like mirrors, glass, plastic, cellophane, petroleum, jelly, isomalt crystals. The choice for transparent materials represents a myriad of ways in which neurodiverse individuals experience loss of legibility. In the case of Kurt Cobain, the neurotypical gaze appropriates him as a subject while simultaneously erasing neurodivergence from his narrative. Neurodivergence often coincides with individuals either being labeled and targeted for deviating from the norm, or disappearing entirely from view, or in the case of artists, taken up and appropriated and made responsible to conceal a significant part of themselves from which creativity often emerges. Identification as neurodiverse is often camouflaged with what Tobin Siebers refers to as the masquerade. The pressure to appear normal, in control, happy. In the case of Kurt Cobain, I would argue that legibility as a neurodiverse person continues to be absent from discourses about him, as we are presented with language of the tortured artist, but little information about the social forces surrounding him and the ways in which fame commodified his life, adding increasing pressures to perform. I am now going to take you through a few slides of the work that I produced in this project. So I cut it up more basically and just experimented with it. I don't know if you can see, but that impression in the background is our lovely parking garage to the right. Although visually interesting, so I overlaid them all on top of each other and photographed that, but I still felt like I was clinging to the structure of a famous song. You know, my goal was to get away from what the song meant literally, and to get closer to the materiality of the experience contained in Cobain's words. The challenge is still to represent an exchange of thought, and to do so in a way which produces something tangible, something that feels real. I began to photocopy my laminated sheets, and I played with the enlargement feature on the copier, enlarging sections which could become their own micro-utterances. Looking at the images produced exposed the following found poems in haiku format. These short haiku poems reflect different themes, such as emotional intensity and loss, self-medicating, escape, and hope for catharsis and transformation. I sense in them physical, emotional, and spiritual fluctuation. What is expressed is often emotional conflict centering around self-medicating, and escape as an unsupported means to deal with pain and loss. Although I find these interesting as fragments, much of the original entry feels like an elaborate exploration of what it means to self-medicate, and I don't find myself doing something new, sorry about that. Discovering something new. Since new information is missing from this experiment, I move on. Thinking about Bakhtein's concept of polyphony and the ever-present negative discourses of pathology in Cobain's speech, I wanted to work with a third voice in my poetry thought experiments. I wanted to incorporate the medical model voice, as it tends to embed disease within the individual in a flattened sort of way that smothers the voices of the neurodivergent. I chose to use several ADHD questionnaires, which I downloaded from the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA for short. I chose 2 questions from the questionnaires, which I thought might be referring to Cobain in this context. In particular, do you have any trouble sleeping? And have you ever felt bad or guilty about your drinking or drug use? Equally important to this text contained in this image is the abstract image of myself appearing in the background. This tracing is the ephemeral reminder that human bodies are attached to these words, and that these bodies are both ubiquitous and absent. The pink of my cell phone case creates a fleshy blob where the shape of the head and the face should be, and in looking at this image, I recall my efforts to disappear from view as a younger person. I erased my picture from my middle school yearbook, the ink wearing away easily with my red pencil eraser. The mirror brings to mind the distortions neurodivergent individuals see when looking at themselves from the outside, and the background becomes a dark and depthless pool. I am left with many impressions when I look at this image, the collision of my academic research with my memory. I then transcribed the words, so I transcribed all of those words as they appear on this slide to the left. And I used a text mixer or a poem generator to create an Ars criteria poem from the transcribed text, which is not included here. I loved how this random poem turned out, not because of its inherent quality, but because I was surprised by the emphasis and the pattern of the words trouble sleep. For time's sake, I didn't include it here. There are multiple moments in the poem where there is an active statement of, I trouble sleep, which triggered for me the many purposeful ways I would stay up late into the night, making art with others and engaging in conversations. This was a joyful time, a choice, and a statement I associate with agency and purpose. This poem captures the tension between the racing brain, which can't seem to slow itself, to relax into sleep, and the conscious and purposeful brain choosing not to sleep in order to engage in creative pursuits. Capturing this was a surprise to me, and thinking about sleeplessness in this way prompted me to write the poem that you see on this slide, which summarizes my own embodied tendencies to be information-seeking and how these tendencies have led to a purposeful troubling of sleep. Yurgo posits that autistic individuals have their own queer rhetorics. The communication of hand gestures, stimming, rocking, vocalizations, body gestures, pauses, and delays, the ephemera of which must be considered valid forms of communication and acts of selfhood. The concept of neurological queerness has provided a useful framework to think about alternative modes or rhetorics of expression for neurodivergent individuals, which has led me to view the process of journaling as a unique space for those who interpret sociality differently and express themselves in different ways. Mind meandering, as it is demonstrated throughout this pilot study, represents my own neuroqueer embodied reality as I experience it. Queering arts-based research through a reflexive practice of art making and conceptual poetic experiments, where linear expectations of outcome dissolve, creates an opening where neuroqueer embodied rhetorics can emerge. ADHD rhetorics of sensation, emotion, memory, time, and material tracings. Arts-based research supports mind meandering through embracing ambiguity, eroding binaries, and questioning existing power structures, interrogating language, subjectivity, social organization, and power with what Eisner refers to as multiple ways of knowing. Through the process of mind meandering and engaging with a neurodiverse person's journals, I am able to disrupt dominant narratives and assumptions about ADHD and reframe these discourses. That's all I got.
My name is Minggu. I'm a PhD candidate from Penn State University. And my co-advisors are Dr. Kimberly Powell and Dr. Charles GRAE. They have been very supportive. And I also want to thank you, Ohio State, hosting this event, and the food and reception is really great. And also thank you, Molly, for the accommodations. Thank you. The title of my dissertation is The Pedagogy of Waiting, Rethinking Our Education with Disability Studies. To start with my presentation, I want to say thank you to Creative Growth Art Center, which is where I conducting my field work for almost 1 year in California, in Oakland, California, which is considered as the world's largest and oldest contemporary art space for adults with developmental, mental, and physical disabilities. The artists, staff, and families and volunteers, they are really a big component of my work, and I want to say thank you to them. In the early afternoon on November 27, 2018, Nicole Storm sat on a long brown leather couch in the hallway, wearing 2 layers of sweaters against the cold of the Creative Girls Art Studio. The back of this couch sat against a photo wall next to a square wood table under a bulletin board. Located in between the studio space and the kitchen, the couch was where artists would sit during break time or before class begins in the morning. The back of this couch sat against a photo wall next to a square wood table. It was a place where one could see the staff or artists pass as they go to the kitchen or go to bathrooms. It was also a space where artists would lay down if they feel sick or sleepy. On the opposite side of the couch, there were 2 bookshelves that contained the Creative Girls library, which is on this side. The artist would often grab a book from the library, sit on the couch and read it. Nicole had a different way of using the couch. With her legs stretched out, she sat slouched against the couch. She would draw on the wet mat board with a blue Sharpie marker, murmuring to herself and gesticulating from time to time. Because it was not a break time, most of the artists were working in the studio, and nobody else was using the couch. On the square table, she put a white storage file box containing papers she was currently working with. Her belongings were strewn across the entire length of the couch. Nicole's belongings include a whiteboard, 2 brown paper tubes, a piece of brown paper, a poster board with ripped edges leaning against the wall, a black pack with slices of fabric on which Nicole had rendered a drawing, a soft fabric handbag with a stack of paper in it, a plastic bag with colorful markers in it, a gray sweater with decorative hole on it, a black lunch bag, a piece of yellow paper that was from the Days of the Dead event organized by the Oakland Museum of California, with Nicole's writing on it, a red marker on top of that piece of yellow paper, and a short stack of newspaper with Nicole's drawing on them. All of this assembled element created by Nicole, including the movements of people passing by the hallway, constituted the environment in which she worked. Nicole's constructed environment constitutes a milieu that resonates with what Derek McCormack calls, quote, an affective intensity in relations, or distinctive spatial sensibilities. The hallway space in which she worked was, quote, not so much a 3-dimensional container for activities, but shifting configurations of bodies, materials, and ideas taking place with different degrees of affective intensity and duration. It is through the shifting configurations of a milieu of the cardboard she carries, the sound of her murmurs, the photos of retired staff on the wall, the memories of being with the staff, and the interaction with artists passing by, that she is affected by the intensities in the space. Yet, for Nicole, this space is not just a setting for her work, it is her work. Nicole is not just working in the hallway space and experiencing its affective intensity. She is archiving its shifting configurations and use the bodies materials and ideas taking place to create art. Nicole's mother categorized her practice as archiving. Nicole's mother explains during our conversation. Her mom said, in her, which is Nicole Storm, in her mind, she's recording events. You notice there are some letters and some numbers. You and I won't be able to discern them. And I'm not sure if she can, and I'm not sure if she can go back and remember what she's recording at that time. But in the moment, emphasized by her mom while we are talking, but in the moment, she's recording events and what she's observing and remembering. So I'm gonna go back to I changed the sequence a little bit. Okay. So with her mom's understanding of Nicole's work as archiving, Nicole's spatial archiving practice resonates with artist Simone Osthoff's definition of, quote, archive as artwork, and philosopher Michel Foucault's conceptualization of archives as, quote, the discursive practices of things and events. Both Osthoff and Foucault argue that the archive is more than a repository of documents, a mere collection of material preserved for the future. Nicole's collection of handouts and printouts record memories through drawing, murmuring, and walking in the studio. This practice, however, functions as more than a formal representative of the past. Her purpose is not to confirm, but to reject archival stability, as Osthoff contends. Osthoff argues that archive as artwork reject history as a stable archive documented chronologically, and instead underlines the, quote, temporal and spatial displacement, the ghost in our experience. She advocates for archival generativity that considers dimensions archive that escape or disrupt representation, and ask questions such as, whose memory get to be preserved in archives? In doing so, Osthoff's categorizing of the archive's performativity as artwork fosters the ghost of history accumulation to make a way for the, quote, reveries in thought, end quote, that she argues generate from the uncertain and contingent dimensions of the archive. Nicole's art emerges from these contingent dimensions in archival practice, and in doing so, challenges foundational assumptions of disability experience and its relation to art. Murmuring is a significant sonic dimension of Nicole's archival art practice. Like the sustained monophonic effect of a drum in music, her murmuring provides a sonorous foundation for the contingent polyphonies of her archival art practice. We will watch a video created by her later, and we will hear it. Examples of her murmuring include the following. Quote, Lisa is not here anymore. Nicole is referring to Lisa Campbell, another artist at Creative Groups who passed away in early 2018. Quote, okay, this is the beginning of, and Nicole is pointing at the printout of her brother's email. And she said, did she just say that name? Okay. At the same time, Nicole sitting on the floor of the textile supply area, and that is next to the hallway, and is adding several show lines on the magazine that she has at that moment. When murmuring, she always references her belongings, posters, memories, murmurs while she writes a line, pauses when a line ends, and then resumes speaking with each new line. This murmur, write, pause, resume process perform a rhythm that resonates with what philosophy Deleuze and Fix-Guattari refers as, quote, a communication of milieux, or, quote, coordination between heterogeneous of space-times. Deleuze and Guattari conceptualized rhythm as not occurring in, quote, a homogeneous space-time, end quote, that can be measured by chronological and geographical standards. Instead, rhythm is a communication of heterogeneous milieux that is always changing and incommensurable. Nicole's art practice not only highlights the milieu of sound, but also underlines the communication between milieux, the sonic milieu. For example, she said she hear a volunteer shout out the name Zoe, or the milieu of memory, she remembering Lisa is not here anymore, and the milieu of materialized surroundings, like an email printout, a magazine, or marker that she has. Nicole's murmurs into archival memory at different events. She carries objects to different studios and make temporal marks, layering lines and circles with her murmur, write, pause, resume process on object on different days. Put another way, by memorizing, murmuring, walking, and writing, Nicole performs what Deleuze and Guattari refers as the heterogeneity of space-time. As what I mentioned about how Nicole's mom emphasized, she's not sure if Nicole can discern those lines and stories, but she emphasized that in the moment she's recording events and what she's observing and remembering. What Nicole's mom suggests is that by observing, taking notes, and drafting her observations, Nicole familiarized with documented and archived circumstances and events of her world to memory. Nicole's process of archiving, quote, in the moment resonates with the very root of statement and the occurrence of the statement thing that emerges from the discursive practice that Foucault defines as archive. For Foucault, an archive does not constitute, quote, the libraries of all libraries, end quote, but a discursive practice that enables statements of things and events to emerge and at the same time to undergo modification. All of Nicole's belongings and the brown couch, her memory with stuff, sound emerging from the studio and people passing by the hallway allow her to mark and murmur statements of things and events occurring around her. Nicole's mother, as quoted before, also suggests that Nicole may not go back and remember the statement of, that she's making. Rather, Nicole modifies and reenact the statement in a new way, make another archival performance. Like in this picture, Nicole is archiving her own archival artwork that hangs in the gallery with another piece of paper with a green marker. This performance destabilizes past events. In this way, Nicole's performance disperses the artwork from a fixed representation of art made by disabled artists and modifies it to allow, quote, a multiplicity of statements to emerge. In this archival performance, art can be seen as a, quote, dynamic and generative production tool. Nicole is performing a living archive in the Creative Growth art studio space, but her living archive also extends beyond the physical space of Creative Growth with memories of people and outside objects. In other words, she's archiving both physical and contingent spaces. Nicole's archival performance is constitutive of her fascination with the milieu in which she works, the people, images, ideas, materials, and events that are assembled around her. Her interaction with this aspect through her murmur, write, pause, and resume art making process shed light on the reveries that all stuff contents cannot be documented and stabilized. Accordingly, in the following conversations from my field notes, I work with the studio manager, Matt Dost, and Nicole to ask Nicole some questions. We asked her experience of working at Creative Growth Art Studio, and she replies, quote, fascinating together. So Matt said, what do you like most about Creative Growth? Nicole, she sighed twice, and I can't think of anything. And Matt said, you cannot think of anything you like most about Creative Growth? Nicole, I like, we are fascinating together. At the same time, while she's speaking, Nicole is using a marker to write on a piece of newspaper. The manager said, you like what we are together? And Nicole said, fascinating together. Matt, fascinating together, interesting. And I said, oh, and Nicole said, exactly. This is one of her favorite words. And Matt said, when you come here, what makes you most happy? And Nicole said, happy? And Nicole started writing on the newspaper again. It is a Nataki makes me happy. Matt, what makes you happy? And Nicole said, a Nataki table. Matt said, I don't know what that is. And Nicole said, a Nataki table is like a buffet table. And she's moving her hand and described the shape of a table. Matt said, a buffet table makes you happy. We don't have a buffet table here. Are you thinking of a hotel or something? What about Creative Growth specifically? And Nicole, specifically? And I said, you can see anything. And Nicole said, I would say about the furniture. Matt said, the furniture, interesting. And I said, the furniture, wow. And then Nicole said, and Nicole continued, the organization of the offices, the organization of the staff like that. Oh, and then Nicole pointed Matt. He's talking about people who are not really here. Lisa is not here. And Matt tried to stop her and said, so this is one of your favorite topic of conversations is that the staff are not here anymore. Very important to Nicole. Keep track of people who used to work here. And Nicole said, exactly. And I would like to, this is a video that I work with Nicole and also the studio, digital media instructor at Creative Growth, Elena. I asked Nicole to wear a GoPro because she always moves in the studio. So it's we have a footage of almost 3 months, but this is 1 minute, just in terms of the time.
I see is Nicole Diana Stone Factory. Watching him.
So the last footage that sometime I will let her know that if you don't want wear, let me know, just put it on. So the last image we saw her face is when she put the GoPro on the table. So capture her face. It's all the video taken by Nicole with her permission. And we have a long version, which is 5 minutes on Vimeo. You can just Google Creative Growth Art Center, Nicole Diana Stone Factory. It's a longer version. Finally, my experience of Nicole's creative practice is evident in the documentary photographs and the video here I show in this presentation. Nicole expressed that liking the way everyone and everything, quote, are fascinating together in the Creative Growth Art Center spaces. Rather than liking one particular thing about the spaces, she was enthralled by the center as a complex of milieus. This photographic moment shows how she assembled materials and, according to their affective intensities, the way in which Nicole sees space. Each photograph or scene in the video and depicts a constructed configuration that, when assembled together, categorize the archival performativity of Nicole's art. In doing so, they depict how I experienced the performativity of Nicole's practice. I followed and interacted with Nicole's murmur, write, pause, resume, rhythm in different spaces. Other times, I was uncertain where she was or where she was moving next. I saw this rhythm in the archival performativity of Nicole's art as layers of circle loops, waves, cross hatches, vertical lines, numbers, letters, her walkings, murmurings, and gesticulating in different spaces. It is through this rhythm and her contingent relationship to memories that Nicole's art rejects archival stability for archival generativity. What I talk here in this presentation is generated from my encounter with the archival performativity of Nicole's art, and is designed so that you, as an audience, to explore the photographic and configurations and rhythm interaction of Nicole's art through and across spaces. It is through this presentation I invite you as the audience to consider your reading of her work as an archival encounter. So, to move to a different direction, you may ask, Nicole is one of the artists, many artists that work at Creative Arts Center. So, why I choose Creative Growth to work for my dissertation? So I think I should introduce a little bit about my dissertation work. Although disability legislation has provided increased opportunity for students with disability to learn art in classrooms and art centers since the 1970s, the field of art education has generally remained uncritical of its delimiting assumptions and pejorative representations of disability, which I quote Dr. Jennifer Richardson and John Durbin, who's an alumni here, and also Alice Weckler. And also my experience working with children with autism in China make me realize those stereotypes. In doing so, disability experience in art classroom have often been overlooked, dismissed, and or stigmatized by normative understanding of art making and art learning. To challenge such disenfranchisement, my study advocates for the nuance and differentiate experience of people with disability that otherwise go unrecognized by ableist art curriculum and pedagogy. For my dissertation, like what you have seen, I conducted fieldwork for 1 year at Creative Growth. Although scholars from the field of art education and disability have acknowledged the accomplishment of that center. However, their study kind of limit to brief discussion of individual artists and their artworks. So I choose to do a long-term ethnographic research. During my 1 year long fieldwork placed at Creative Growth, I applied ethnographic method to investigate the following teaching and learning process at Creative Growth. First, how disability experience is in art making move between, emerge from, and act upon normative representation of disability. How teachers' pedagogy of waiting, which is a concept I will mention a little bit later, encourage and facilitates student artist creative process. Third, how disability art making questions and informs pedagogical practice and educational content for all learners. Whereas art education practice have been dominated by medical social model of disability, my dissertation advocates for a quote, creative model that conceptualizes the creative potential of disability, as opposed to medical model of disability that understand disability as a biological deficit or social model that understand disability as a social phenomenon that is constituted by restrictive technologies and facilities. A creative model of disability recognizes non-normative embodiment as, quote, productive incapacities and creative alternatives that are integral to art education. We have a lot of parties. In addition to disability scholarship, in my conceptualization of creative model, I reference philosopher John Dewey, artist Alan Caproll, and human geographer Derek McCormack, like I mentioned before, whose scholarly writings about the characteristic of artistic experience are in accordance with the rhythmic associations and interactions between disabled bodies, social and physical barriers, embodied normalized culture beliefs, and with different bodies engaged with environment. The framework of the creative model provides ways of understanding disability experience on their own terms, which is constitutive of disabled artists' non-normative potentials for creating art. As such, it is critical for art educators to consider disability from framework of creative model, which accounts for the nuanced differentiations of disability experience. Okay, so I have no time, but I can talk more during the discussion. I just want to show some pictures before those are all them. They have artist talk. And thank you.
Good morning, almost good afternoon. All right. You were born in this country. You're an American citizen. Remember that. I began college for the first time when I graduated high school a year early at the age of 17. I remember walking onto the university campus for the first time, feeling disconnected. It reminded me of when I was a young girl moving from a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood in New Jersey to a predominantly non-Hispanic neighborhood in the middle of Pennsylvania. Walking around the college campus, I again felt like I was on another planet and didn't quite belong. I only lasted there barely a year, failing out and deciding it would be better for me to marry my teenage sweetheart at 18. I remember my father going with me to the dean's office to discuss my situation. I have no recollection of what was said as I sat in the dean's office, but I remember feeling invisible and belonging and not belonging anywhere. I can hear the shattering of what I thought was reality, a deep desire for something more that had been building up inside of me. After more than a decade since that day, a deteriorating marriage that I needed to leave, and 3 children later, at age 31, I walked into my new predominantly white campus, again feeling like I didn't belong. During my first year as an adult learner, pursuing my bachelor's degree, I needed to take an elective. One of the only classes that would fit my tight schedule that was hyphenated with motherhood was an introduction to women's studies. I had no idea what the class was, or that there was even a field with this name. I grew up in a traditional home where my father worked outside of the house and my mother stopped working outside of the home when she had me, her first child. I was shocked the first day of my Introduction to Women's Studies undergraduate course as a Latina woman walked into my class and introduced herself as the professor. This radically changed my life. For the first time, I was witnessing what a Latina could be other than a mother. And I began to learn about my history as a Latina in the United States. From that day forward, I have aimed to curate my life through learning about my heritage, my ancestry, US context, and why I have lived with a strong sense of not belonging. It was in the Introduction to Women's Studies course that I first heard the name of the Chicana feminist writer Gloria Anzaldúa, among others. Many of the testimonios I read in This Bridge Called My Back resonated with me. Anzaldúa, through her writings, urged me and inspired me to prioritize goals and practice the life I wanted as an artist, and to honor my story, which initiated a journey of self-empowerment and a sense of belonging to myself. Spanish is my private language. I crossed the threshold into English. However, I quickly realized that this Introduction to Women's Studies class was unique. I sought to take every class from the small pool of Latina studies classes available on campus. In doing so, the stark reality became apparent. Again, I felt I didn't belong in most of my other classes because the curriculum taught excluded experiences and voices of people of color from education, art, and curating. I became aware of the things I did not possess: knowledge of myself, my history, art training, or a language and vocabulary to articulate myself through. English is, after all, my second language. When I was 5, in public school, kindergarten, one day, my mother was furious. I remember fragments as she angrily pulled me out of the meeting at the end of the school year with the teachers. I remember her advocating for me. Mi hija nació aquí en los Estados Unidos. Es americana. My daughter was born here in the United States. She is an American. And I never returned the following year. Instead, my mother registered me to begin in a private all-English speaking and teaching Catholic school. Later, I would understand what happened. My mother was offended that the public school I was attending was beginning to introduce the concept of bilingual English as a second language. And because of the changing local community from predominantly white to Hispanic, the elementary school implemented a trial program of pulling students out of the classroom for ESL classes. My teacher thought I would be a good candidate for this course since I was Hispanic and Spanish is my first language. My parents' perspective was that at home we spoke Spanish, and outside of the home my brother and I would pick up English. In school, maintaining a bilingual practice. However, the school forcefully suggested the pulling out of class for strategic ESL classes. My mother did not agree. She thought it was a horrible offense for the school to even suggest that I should take a bilingual English course. I remember having a difficult time understanding my English-speaking friends and teachers in kindergarten. I had attended a pre-kindergarten school where I still had some Spanish-speaking friends. My life consisted, and my whole world was in Spanish until kindergarten. My friends, my family, my neighbors, my church, and school were all predominantly Spanish-speaking. Ironically, the elementary school, Horace Mann, that I went to kindergarten in North Bergen, New Jersey, that I had attended briefly, changed their mission a few years after that encounter of my mother pulling me out of school. The elementary school developed a two-way bilingual program where all curriculum is taught in both English and Spanish simultaneously. In 1997, the school received a grant for this program, radically changing the education and curriculum narrative to be facilitated in both English and Spanish, and by 2002, becoming the exception of a pure dual language magnet school. When I arrived to my new private school, it was a major culture shock. I remember being scared and not knowing how to communicate with the other kids and the teachers who were English speaking. It was sink or swim. I had 2 Spanish speaking friends in that elementary school, and we clung together, Monica and Manuel. Eventually, I did learn English. but I always felt that I didn't belong. Everything about me and my life felt completely different. The way my mother did my hair, the shoes I wore, my lunches, and our extracurricular activities. For example, I wasn't in cheerleading. I didn't even know what that was. I remember in 5th grade, my hair was turning curly. Walking, unlike everyone else's in my school, they pointed and laughed. Because the education I received in elementary school through high school failed to include me, and when they tried to include me, it resulted in outrage. I grew up living in between and feeling like I didn't belong anywhere. People of color have been required to assimilate, look, speak, and act like their white neighbors, educators, artists, and curators. However, Anzaldúa explains in the preface of This Bridge We Call Home that the whole picture isn't just about displacing whiteness, although necessary, but also critically examining the layers of whiteness as not only crucial of white identities, but of whiteness as an institutionalized way of thinking, educating, and moving in the world. Next, college courses fail to theorize and include experiences like mine in the art field. Again, I was feeling an all too familiar feeling that I have felt throughout my whole life, not belonging. It was the first academic setting I had with other Latina students where we became vulnerable with each other through our testimonios. Just as important, I know the value of sitting in the classroom seats, witnessing a Latina enter into the room and open a window into testimonios, poetry, listening, and sharing lived experiences that rarely are voiced in academia. Based on my experiences of not belonging in myself, my autohistoria teoría is a process for self-empowerment. I am compelled to share my experience as a learner because I realize the value of knowing my histories, and I believe other underrepresented learners, like myself, also may benefit from knowing their histories that have been silenced or marginalized in education. So, I just shared with you all my testimonio, or a part of it, a part of my life, a part of who I am and my identity. And Gloria Anzaldúa calls this autohistoria, testimonio, autohistoria, and she creates this theory of testimonios and autohistoria called autohistoria teoría. So autohistoria is the history of self or oneself, and autohistoria teoría is the theory of our own histories, right? So the creating of one story with agency occurs in one of her 7 transformative acts in her conocimiento theory, which I will also discuss. And it is about creating a new story for oneself. And she expands this into the theory of autohistoria as a way to sew together our fragmented lived experiences as a way to reframe, as a way to redeem our stories for ourselves. The deep critical self-reflectiveness of autohistoria teoría redeems individuals who have often felt a sense of not belonging, been excluded and silenced. The power to curate new ways of thinking from lived experiences and connections to others provokes social transformation. Throughout the 7 transformative acts of conocimiento and autohistoria teoría, curation is necessary to gather the valued aspects of one's life in order to be complete, to omit or to sever that which does not serve the individual. Part of Anzaldúa's vision is for peace and love of self and others via a pursuit of balance through spiritual practice. For Anzaldúa, spirituality is a perspective, what she calls a symbology system, and through spirituality we seek balance and harmony with our environment. Anzaldua's unique inclusion of spirituality within theory is a critical component which layers include a shape-shifting of form, of imagining and embodying the words that are written and continuously relational. Her conocimiento theory is one that has 7 recursive, what I call transformative acts. And they're listed here. And they're recursive, they're not linear, they're not hierarchical, even though I have them in a list form. She imagines them as being spaces that in our everyday life we inhabit, whether consciously or unconsciously, whether intentional or not. These are things that we go through in our daily practice, which is a form of spirituality. And she believes this to be a creative act. So conocimiento is reached via creative acts. Writing, art making, dancing, healing, teaching, meditation, spiritual activism, both mental and somatic. The body too is a form and a site of creativity. So I refer to her conocimiento theory as transformative acts because in my experience, her theory instigates a very deep reflection which intensifies when engaged, changing something within us. The Spanish term for knowledge or consciousness is the word conocimiento. It is a theory developed by Anzaldúa through the process of grappling with her own identity, her own history, her own heritage and feelings of not belonging. Conocimiento, according to Anzaldúa, can be described as a type of spiritual inquiry towards self-love and validation. Anzaldúa was, I quote, driven by the desire to understand, know, y saber, to know, how human and other beings know. Beneath your desire for knowledge rides the hunger to understand and love yourself, end quote. Conocimiento's transformative acts can be interpreted to symbolize the 7 chakras or energies, which according to Eastern philosophy hold our mind, body, and soul in balance. Anzaldúa explains that these 7 transformative acts are within each other and the struggles between the knower and the shadow places that exist in us. Places that are dark, repressed, and full of pain. The transformative acts are processes of dying and being reborn within oneself repeatedly and various places in our lives. Borderlands, La Frontera, Towards a New Mestiza Consciousness, was one of her first groundbreaking books that maybe you have heard of, hopefully you have read, in the 1990s, pioneering a whole genre of autohistoria teoría, and testimonio work through her Chicana lens. And when I read this book the first time, because I've read it several times since, I was blown away that this woman, who is an ordinary woman living in this world, wrote this book using English and Spanish and indigenous language, and it was her own. It was her testimony coming out in this book form, her autohistoria. It resonated with me deeply, and it changed my course going forward of how I thought of myself and how I thought about others and in relationship to others. In this second edition of Borderlands, in the back, there is a interview, question and answer section that Karen Attias does with Gloria Anzaldúa. And in one of those questions, Karen Attias wants to engage in this idea of not belonging in an interview that she conducted which was included in the second edition. And Attias asked Anzaldúa, how do you see this intercultural situation with regard in the Chicano culture and the Anglo-America's influence? Anzaldúa responds, in that context, one particular image comes into my mind, the banyan tree. It is a tree that is originally from India, but which I saw in Hawaii first. It looks like a solid wall. When the seeds from the tree fall, they don't take root in the ground. They take root in the branches. So the seeds fall in the branches, and it is there above the earth where the tree blooms and forms its fruits. And I thought, that is where we are getting it. Instead of going to the roots of our Hispanic or Chicano culture, we are getting it from the branches, from white dominant culture. I mean, it is not that I reject everything that has to do with white culture. I like the English language, for example, and there is a lot of Anglo ideology that I like as well, but not all of it fits with our experiences and cultural roots. And that is why it is dangerous not to know about your own culture, heritage at all, because then you don't have the chance to choose and select, end quote. Underrepresented people in the United States have historically been marginalized, oppressed, enslaved, and deemed inferior, making it difficult to blossom in society and culture. Similarly, for generations, it was believed that the banyan tree, and in Latin America and the Caribbean, it's called la ceiba, did not flower. However, scientific research later discovered that the banyan tree bears fruits, which are wrapped in thick layers of fruit flesh. When the fruit flesh is cut open, the many pink blossoms growing inside of it become visible. And the banyan's flowers do blossom, but inwardly, and cannot be seen from the outside. I parallel the inward blooming of the blossom to Conocimiento's transformative acts as inward transformation, being enacted as a form of a spiritual manifestation through an active participation in life. The banyan tree, the root system, fruit, and flowers are all interconnected, a living visual metaphor for spiritual practice as awareness that all things are interconnected. In fact, the pollination that occurs with the banyan tree occurs inwardly through the fruits as they are pollinated by banyan wasps. I draw a connection between these banyan wasps and the curating of new perspectives and academic canons, as pollinating and germinating seeds towards transformation from the inside. Because the transformation, the work that is being done through the inside to the naked eye, it may not be visible, but needs to be done. I correlate this to feminist curricular curating approach, where during a semester's time, my observations of learners is limited because transformation is a process, not an end fruit. The process is cyclical and ongoing. So, what did I do? I had been teaching this class, Latina Feminisms, Latinas in the U.S. Gender, Culture, and Society at Penn State, that I was invited to teach by the head of the department at Women's Studies. And I was thinking about everything I just shared with you and that I'm experiencing in my life, and thinking about this class that I'm teaching and how I'm curating the syllabus and the curriculum. And through a lot of conversations, I start to think with my advisor, Dr. Karen Kiefer-Boyd, about how I may be already applying some of this stuff without really intentionally be applying it, right? And how am I experiencing this? How am I facilitating my classes with all of this stuff that I have inside of me, right? My own testimonio and autohistoria. And how is that being reflected when I share it with others? Specifically for students like me that feel like they don't belong, that they don't know their history, and are underserved and underrepresented in environments, right? So my dissertation work and research is specifically about this feminist teacher inquiry, documenting and analyzing my experiences teaching this undergraduate course, and the focus being the development and implementation of this transformative feminist teaching approach, a personal theorizing of my testimonio, and observing my learners, my students. So the question that I ended up as my focus for my dissertation work is how are theories of autohistoria, teoría, and conocimiento curated as curriculum, enacted, and experienced by the teacher and students? I critically reflected and documented my own transformation as facilitator and researcher in teaching the undergraduate course. My rationale being twofold. First, the facilitator must be on their own journey of self-awareness, consciousness, and self-empowered, and a critical self-reflective person. So these are things that I have to come prepared with into my classroom environment. This is crucial as to not perpetuate a top-down hierarchy, and in order to break the cycle of the educator as superior to the learners, and to reproduce a Eurocentric framework. These are the things that I am challenging, that I'm resisting, that I don't want to do. So I need to be critically self-reflective of how I'm not only the curriculum that I'm using in this class, that I'm creating around, but how am I implementing it? How am I facilitating the space and conversations with my learners? Secondly, all learners in higher education who have a sense of knowing, wounds, tensions, or difficulty, and are underserved can benefit from this transformative curatorial approach. Learners that are underprivileged by the entanglements of socioeconomic, race, ethnicity, sexuality, access to resources, education, and gender are acutely affected in education. However, there is a caution that many learners do not know what they do not know. In the same way that I had no idea the other worlds and possibilities that existed outside and within myself when I sat in that undergraduate classroom, learners will most likely enter my educational space, your educational space, without knowing what questions to ask, what histories to know, or even that their own lived experiences offer valid spaces of knowledge that no one else can know. Really? Already? All right. So I did a lot of reading and more theorizing using Ansalduas. These are, although of course it's a dissertation, so there's so many different voices and funds of knowledge, right? But Gloria Ansalduas, and she has many different theories that she wrote about before she died. But the four that I'm specifically addressing in my dissertation work is autohistoria, teoría, conocimiento, which the two that I briefly mentioned, also borderland theory and spiritual activism, which I briefly mentioned as well. And I'm putting her and her theories in communication, in conversation with Maxine Green, Fernando Ortiz, which he was from Cuba, and he did a lot of work with the idea of transculturation. He coined the term, allegedly. And Dr. Ana Louise Keating, non-oppositional theory, and then racial formation by Omni and Wynant. So these are some of the voices that are coming into play as I'm thinking through all of this. Some of the main overarching themes or ideas or concepts that I've been grappling with is sense of not belonging, healing through our wounds. What does that mean? What can that look like? What has that meant for me? How am I sharing that with others? And how can others learn from each other through healing through our wounds, right? And that's and that's a huge topic in itself. And then decolonize courses, right? Decolonizing the academic canon intentionally. Curating educational spaces that decolonize white hegemonic academic canons and empower underrepresented learners. Curator, or the practice of curator, as an agent of knowledge production, theorizing, curating environments for critical thinking. And last night we saw an example of that with Dana, right, at the art gallery, where she was explaining a little bit about the works and the conversation with each other, and that they're not just aesthetically pleasing things on a wall, right? So I am also positing that healing is a process. It's a process that is fluid, and it is ongoing, and it is recursive. So what I decided to do is, I have this class, I curated the syllabus for it, and my two sources of data are my own field notes and observations, meetings with students, my journal reflections, and then also my students' work, right? Their artifacts, there's anonymous surveys that I give them, class assignments, discussions, and they also have their own personal student journal reflections. And this is an example of one of those. So they had the option of taking whatever creative liberty they wanted to document their journal entries, and whatever they did just had to be on a blog post that only I could see, a blog that they created. So this would be, well, until now, but I have consent. But this would be an example of what that could look like, right? This is another, wait. Okay, I forgot to say something really important, I'm sorry. As an educator curating curriculum, I facilitated the making of what I consider to be temporary homes, which become places that can enact this process of healing that I'm alluding to. So new narratives can arrive from that, and this idea of temporary homes can be the classroom space, but it can also be the gallery, the museum space, right? This conference is a temporal home, right? And in curating, I am specifically defining the role of curator, facilitator, educator, researcher, and learner as an intentional use of curriculum materials centered on underrepresented voices, testimonies that are often absent, right? It's about interconnectedness, about simultaneously curating our own stories, autohistoria, teoría, and testimonio, theorizing about our own selves and our own lives, and creating a world which then also plants a hypothesis for the self and the world, and proposes a narrative, a story, and generates a new perspective. So my methodology was creating this, and I took Borderlands, and that was my foundational text for this course. And what I did is I saw a lot of overlap with the book and her conocimiento theory. And that's what I used as my map for my curriculum planning for this course, and for the assignments, which I can talk more about later, I guess. But this would be an example of another reflective journal entry from one of my students, creative writing and poetry, after seeing a movie about Cuba and everyday life there. This is another example of an idea that I'm grappling with, of embodying a decolonized canon, right? So it's not just implementing, it's not just throwing in diversity and multiculturalism, but it's actually an embodiment of what this looks like through spiritual activism. And this would be, for one example that a student brought up, that she would define as that, right? This woman having a voice for her people, and it's inspired by her mother, right, who's taking care of these people. Interconnectedness. So this idea that vulnerability is uncomfortable and it's hard, and it's not something that is normally found in a classroom space. So many students were surprised by that. Not belonging. So there was a lot of, another form of creative art came out through actually making things, and that was very liberal, what they could do. So this would be one representation of a student that was grappling with her own identity, what she had been brought up in thinking, the social constructions around what it is to be a woman, what it is to be this exchange student from England, now in the United States taking a Latino studies course, right? And then this idea of healing through our wounds. So what happens when we share and we talk about our pain and our traumas and our lived experiences? And then we realize that we're not the only ones, right? This was one of my students that at the end of the next semester, he wanted to take the class again, which I was surprised. He was one of 2 male students in the class. And he said, I cannot take modules under 300 anymore, so I will not be joining you this semester. I hope it's a good one and you expand the consciousness of another heterosexual man somewhere. So that was, I think, the highest praise for that course. And implications going forward in our education, there's so many. So the role of curator, and I correspond that with the word in Spanish for curator is curadora. So this idea of healer, of coming together, bringing experiences together and healing through them. Transcultural spaces, which I alluded to briefly. And testimonio as a form of spiritual practice within academia. Okay. Yes, I am done. That's okay. Emotional labor was one of the things that I found very challenging throughout the course. So that's it. All right, thank you.
Thank you for your presentations, very thoughtful work. I'm going to start off this time. So one of the things that sort of got my attention was how each of you sort of had this focus on attention and sort of careful attention, sort of in looking at, you know, the processes of the people whose work you're looking at, or whose processes you're looking at. And I'm interested to hear from you a little bit more about how this idea of attention and the very close attention, like you were talking about, you know, you gave details about the movement and the murmuring and the, you know, how your participant was moving through the space. And then Michelle, you were looking at like the words and really parsing them very, very carefully, like backwards and forwards. And Leslie, you were also, you know, well, I don't have to belabor the point, but I'd like you to. So I'd like you to think about or respond to this idea of looking of attention and careful attention in your methodologies or as a methodological act. If you would, please.
Do you want to start? You want me to start?
Oh, if you want to.
I would not classify my work as giving it a lot of attention, how you're describing it. Just in that, although it's very intentional work, it's been very organic, right? So it all happened, like all of this that has happened with this particular course, for example, has evolved over time serendipitously. So it hasn't been something that I set out to do. But with the methodology, trying to improve it. One of the things I didn't mention is that this was what I shared today about this class. This was actually the 3rd iteration of this class that I had taught. And the first 2 iterations, because it was cross-listed with Latino studies, my experience had been one that was predominantly Latinx and Afro students in my classes, where I might have had one white student. When I decided to do it for my dissertation research, the 3rd iteration, I was shocked because when I got there, I only had like 3 Hispanic Latino students and everyone else was white. So it totally flipped the script on me. And I wasn't sure how that was going to impact my work. And I thought, well, I guess we'll see what happens. And if I'm talking about non-oppositional theory and you know, being intentional and interconnectedness, then how is this going to play out for real, right? In a different way. So I didn't respond to your.
Well, I was thinking about like the idea of the focus of the attention to language and the nuances of language that might have possibly come up using Ansaldo.
Yeah.
I thought it was just really interesting as I started to get into my research to think about all the voices that we embody without being aware of it. And just, like looking at Cobain's work, like I'm not like them, but I can pretend feels like his voice. But when he's talking about being very lazy, it feels like all of those voices that we kind of hear as we're navigating through school spaces, this idea of yourself that you've absorbed, it becomes part of you, even though it's not helpful or useful, and you move with it through spaces. So, for me, I guess I would agree with the statement that I have a very organic approach. Like, I don't know that I'm always consciously, or not to use a psychological word, I let it happen. I relax into it. But at the same time, there's this careful attention to these different voices.
Yeah, thank you for asking the question. I feel like this attention really ties into the way that I work, because I, after coming to Penn State to study, I start to critique my own work in Beijing of working with students with autism. So as a person identified as an able-bodied person, so I always pay attention to my own assumptions. So I think it's a process never ends. And even today's presentation, I resist talk about my framework first. Instead, I want to talk about the artist first, because I feel like I'm always I want to be a person working with them, pay attention. And also, for me, paying attention really to the pedagogy of waiting that I mentioned in my title. I'm really strongly influenced by my Chinese cultural background, especially a Taoist concept called Wu Wei, which means non-action or effortless action. It's about like undoing and forgetting a cultural standard or goal-oriented goals. So I think this is resonate with paying attention. Paying attention when I work with students, if I have my goal, what I want them to do. So I think attention really ties into my teaching and methodology of doing my research. Yeah.
So the question that I had, I think, Min, what you were just saying sort of paves a really clear path for, and like bear with me for a moment, because one of the benefits of being post-dissertation, and I think it's something that is asked of us a lot when we're grad students, like, oh, make connections between different bodies of research and find the overlaps and find the things, but all you're doing is like focusing on, like, just trying your best to focus on the work that you're doing. But now, sort of, many years past that phase, I have the sort of privilege of sitting here and being like, oh, listen to all this very smart and very interesting research, and here are these overlaps. So I have a path toward that. So Michelle, you were talking about one of the things that I wrote down that you said, and I'm that annoying person who writes down like actual things people say while they're talking, especially when it's unscripted. I'm like, oh, let me ask you about this thing that you said. So you were talking about journaling as you said the words not seeking direction, right? So I thought about that. And then Min, you were talking about Nicole's, the murmuring, and you kept saying this word murmuring over and over and over, and it triggered this, I don't remember if it's starlings or sparrows or the birds, but when they move in flight together, it's called a murmuration. And then Leslie, you were talking about those 7 recursive acts sort of being reached via creative arts, and you said specifically that they're nonlinear, that they sort of like act in Congress and they move and there's not a sort of path or direction. So I was thinking about all of those things, and Min, you sort of cited Deleuze and Guattari's work specifically, but like that non-linearity is definitely central to the work that they do. And then this notion of like difference versus like pathological brokenness in the work, Michelle, that you're talking about. And then this murmuration being this kind of concept of the body without organs, like, you know, we're not sort of like attributing one centralized way of thinking. So here's my question. Like what pedagogy tends to ask us to do, or sort of like the historical traditional way of thinking about pedagogy that we learned and that all of you kind of spoken to how that fails us in many ways. What it asks us to do a lot is to compartmentalize what knowing and learning looks like. And so I'm wondering if you could each think about what a pedagogy of murmuration might be in the work that you're doing. And what I mean by that is that where in your pedagogy, all of those parts are moving without dominance, and that they're responding, like that we are responding with as opposed to each other in the work that we're doing. Like the way that murmuration works, right? There's not like one, I imagine there's not like one single starling or sparrow that's like, come on y'all, let's go this way, right? And so, but it's working. And so that's the response with as opposed to response to, which I think we all sort of learn is what we respond to. We respond to the content, we respond to our students respond to us. And so I wondered if maybe y'all could talk about that a little bit, like thinking about it in that way and what that might look like and how it's already being sort of performed in the work that you're doing, but maybe without that specific language.
It's interesting because like as I'm listening to the others' presentations, I'm always looking for patterns that are similar to my own, or even in the artists that you were looking at, Min, like, yeah, Nicole, like she had tendencies that I feel like I have those tendencies, that tendency to continuously make a mark and, you know, keep going and going and going. So I feel like I was definitely that kid in math class that, you know, they would be like, wow, you solved the math problem that way? Like they never really understood how I could get to the answer. And I just feel like maybe disrupting these power relationships in the classroom becomes important. And that's why I was looking at a process as opposed to a project, or, you know, just kind of the teacher at the top directing everything didn't really work for me. It was more successful when they opened up the closet full of the supplies and materials and said, have at it. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Actually, so in terms of pedagogy, I learned a lot about teaching in the Creative Growth Art Studio. Because when I talked with one of the facilitators, she said everyone may need something slightly different. So there's one artist, she immigrant from Afghanistan, and she does not speak English. So we work with her in a totally different way. You know, we bring materials and experiments. If she would like to try that material. So it's a very experimental process of teaching. So for an artist, she immigrated from China and she cannot speak English either, but I can communicate with her in Chinese. So we, so we kind of also like, it's interesting that I also invited by them to provide a Chinese ink painting workshop there. So I work with this artist, her name is Inga, in the kitchen area. So the artists will walk, by. So after 2 days of workshop, there's one artist in the studio, oh, what are you doing, can I try? So he sit down. So it's a moment that I realized that my several months of experience with the artist, he know me and he saw this, you know, what we are doing, so he just sit down. I think it's a moment of like how I understand these different ways of teaching. Yeah, I'm not sure if this. Yeah.
I'm not really sure what the answer is either.
Yeah, yeah, just.
I think that the power dynamics, I think, is a big component of it, right? So one of the things that I try to embody, to live as a facilitator, is that I'm coming in with the intention and the thinking that I don't know any more or any less than the learners that are there, right? We're all learners, right? We all are validating each other's voices and experiences when we're coming together, and what that can look like in many different ways. For example, one of the things that my students did is writing a part of their own testimonial and sharing it in class. And when everyone had gone, they looked at me, waiting for me to share mine. And I wasn't, it wasn't really on my radar, and they called me out on it. And I was like, yeah, you're right. You all are being vulnerable, right? I need to be held accountable to that same standard that I'm putting forth, right? And so I shared a component of my testimonial, but it was a really interesting point for me because I made myself vulnerable in a way that I had not planned on, first of all, and that I wasn't sure how it was going to be received by the students, and how that would even shift, how that would influence that relationship, right?
Weird question. I'm going to go back to the attention thing a little bit. Oh, sorry. I'm just talking to myself. Sorry. I want to go back to the attention thing, but I'm not going to. But I'm sort of going back. So there's two things. I'm trying to decide which question to ask. Okay, so again, I saw similarities in terms of thinking about performance and how you addressed performance, whether it's as an artist or as a researcher or as a educator. So I'm interested in hearing a little bit more. I felt like I didn't get to hear enough, or like I just want to hear more about how you are thinking about this, looking at the performance of thought in your work, and how that's translating into a making process, and whether you're thinking about that in terms of making art or meaning making in your dissertation, and making of your research questions or your curriculum. It's up to you, but this idea of performance of thought translating to acts of making, if you could talk about that a little bit more.
For me, one of the things that I noticed is that as I have been writing my dissertation and going back through and reflecting on the data and everything, I'm a studio artist, and I had not made art in about 3 years because of just personal stuff, and I didn't have a studio and that type of thing. And I just recently got a studio space, and I just started making art again. And while I've been writing and going through, reflecting on all these experiences, in conversation with my making art, I've noticed that there has been this back and forth that has helped me process and think through what this means to me in different ways, whether it's my heritage, my ancestry, my students. So I think that it has the potential of being integrated as a studio art component of a manifestation of creative arts in this making to know oneself and to theorize about oneself.
I feel like for me it's not that separated. For my own artwork, I do Chinese ink painting, and I'm really into the empty spaces in my work. And those empty spaces resonate with the waiting and the undoing and the non-action. Always have a move of step back, not that full. For me, I feel like my thought and my artwork and my teaching is all intertwined together in some way. I'm really interested in those empty space, what will happen if we do not do it, the undoing. Yeah. So, yeah.
I don't know. I feel like thought performances for me are always, like, my thoughts are naturally chaotic, sensory and disorganized, and the performance for me is retrofitting them into something that's understandable for others. Yeah, I don't know. I have to think about that a little bit longer.
How are we on time? Questions from the group?
It's time for lunch.
Everyone's hungry. Is it lunch?
That's okay. This question, I can just speak loudly. Is that, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. This question is for Min, and I'm just curious about the relationship between what you noticed in your research with Nicole, and also the work that you've done in China with students on the autism spectrum. So I'm just kind of curious, what type of relationship have you seen there between this one individual and then also with the work that you've done in China? Because they're obviously there are probably different ways of working, obviously two different populations. So I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, like so for the student with autism I work with in Beijing, like it's the first time I have a critical understanding of experience. So there's one student I work with for 20 days, and I'm trying to interact. Oh, do you need this? And he never respond me and never have one eye contact. And on the 21st day, I met him at a gallery which exhibit their work. And he said, Miss Min, and I was like, it's a moment I realized that, oh, he just need time to know me, like realize that I assume that we should say hi to each other like immediately. So my experience in China definitely leads me to this research path. And I also did a pilot study in Guangzhou, China. It's a after-school program for students with disabilities, and they have different type of art classroom. Some of, I think it's a little problematic. It's like a one teacher in the front and use the microphone leading. But there's a art studio program which is ask the student with autism to visit local artist studio. And I talked to the artist, and he said he's an artist. He never worked with students with disability. He said, I think they just need a space like a factory, like they just experiment with theater, and, you know, the object, like, you know, and artists just being there, work with them. That's it. We don't need to teach. Like, we don't need the educational like curriculum. And I was imagining how that space looked like when I was in China doing my pilot study. And then I know creative growth. So I was like, wow, that's kind of really resonate with my thought, like how that space looked like. That's the connection. Yeah.
So I think anytime someone engages in research, probably particularly at a doctoral level, because you're so ensconced in it, there are questions that you're trying to answer, not only about who you are, which is really clear in both Leslie and Michelle's research, but also using theory to envision alternative futures or change something about the world. And so in your own words, what would you say through your research you are in, like, what change are you hoping to bring about in the future through the research that you're doing?
It is a great question. I think ultimately what I'm responding to is, why do we look at something or someone and think that they're weird just based on their behavior? Like, I think I was often just dismissed because I was weird. And what you see took 45 years for this performance. So I mean, I feel, maybe we all masquerade a little bit on a certain level, but I think that's what I'm addressing.
I've never been so interested in Kurt Cobain. It's true.
Go for a sec.
My biggest hope is for self-value and self-worth with my learners. Yeah.
Can you repeat the question? I kind of lost my.
So, I mean, I think you've spent 2 years now working through, theoretically, I think probably the changes that you would like to see in the world, right? So what is all this work toward? What changes do you think will happen as a result of all of this work?
In relation to Adhd or?
It's a fairly open question. I mean, I just remember being deeply invested in it for personal reasons in terms of my own professional positionality, but I think everybody has different reasons for doing that. So I suppose, what are the changes that you hope that you will see in your own world, in your own life, but also, more explicitly, for the field, what do you hope this research will bring about, for example, for learners with disabilities, or you and I have had some conversations about these art spaces in particular. What are you hoping will change in those spaces as a result of the research?
I'm not so much like what they will change, but I feel like as an art educator, I feel like we need to always be cautious about our understanding of what is an experience, like, because they show me the much wider range of what constitutes an experience. So I feel like we should really challenge the way I teach and how to work with students, because we have to learn from them, and there are so many things that it's beyond our imagination, and I think as art educator we have to be critical about that.
So I've been engaging in a process with my son's school of their the grades that they get from the state or whatever. He goes to a progressive school, and recently on the forum there was a friend who is a very quantitative person. I want to know why these look like this. Who's going to explain to me why these numbers look like this? And the rest of the parents are like, I just want to make sure that they're fully functioning, happy human beings. I'm not really concerned. So I feel like all three of you need to come to this person's house. A traveling intervention. Oh, yes. Recognize the full scope of what is possible as an educational experience. Will you do that for me?
Sure. I invite everyone to submit manuscripts to my forthcoming edited book, Pedagogies of Murmuration, which I just write now. A co-edited, collaborative publication opportunity for everyone. See me after. Like I don't have enough stuff to do.